So peace, everyone. For those who joined us for the first two panels, welcome back. For those of us just joining us, welcome to Moving Towards Belonging. My name is Bryson Rose. I'm the Director of Advocacy Capacity Building at Hetrick-Martin Institute. The pronouns I use are he and him, and we are so glad to either be in community with you or continue to be in community with you. I have with me my colleague, my radical, amazing friend, Elle. And Elle can introduce themselves and share a little bit about who they are.
Hi, everybody. It's a little funny because I can't see you, but I'll trust that you're there. My name is El Laila. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a counselor at HMI. I'm a social worker by training.
Beautiful. So this panel is really more of like a fireside chat. It's more like Oprah and Gail, an intimate conversation on our own. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what does it mean to have to take these concepts of diversity and belonging and inclusion home, and really talking about what does it mean to have an embodied commitment to making others feel seen and valued and safer. And so we're going to open up this sort of conversation with some intentions and some guidelines so that we can set the space in a way that we want to model that for you. So the first grounding is I want people who are watching to find a comfortable position inside their bodies, whatever that looks like for you. For me, that looks like relaxing my shoulders a bit. That means sort of putting my feet firmly on the ground, perhaps allowing my palms to face up on my thighs, and just paying attention to my breath. Just paying attention to the rhythm of how my body is taking care of itself by breathing. And then sort of noticing different parts of my body that I may have been neglecting for the past couple hours, maybe a couple of days. So starting at the soles of my feet, moving up through my calves into my knees, and asking myself, is there more opportunity for me to create more space inside these for rest and connection? Moving towards my thighs and my torso, my stomach, my midsection, just relaxing all those muscles and asking, can I create more space inside that area? Noticing any tension, right? Up through my chest and my shoulders, my jaw, all surrendering to gravity, right? So paying attention to what my body feels like, what I haven't been paying attention to, or what I've been asked by systems to not pay attention to. Maybe moving throughout, giving a little movement. Again, paying attention to my breath, taking one deep breath in and releasing it. Part of an embodied practice is paying attention to our bodies. And we're often asked not to do that. So in this moment, I've been talking for 2 or 3 hours. I'm going to continue to pay attention to what my body tells me. Right? And that helps me pay attention to other parts of my body when other people are talking to me or I'm receiving information. And my body will tell me how I'm feeling about that. Right? We also want to offer some community invitations. We're here under the pretenses of trying to not perpetuate harm. Right? We're trying to unlearn the practices that may be harmful to us and others. And so we're making assumptions that everyone here is doing that as well. And that's what we're offering. Now, I'm going to kick it over to Elle, who's going to ask us to talk about our invitation for what it means to be embodied.
Thank you so much for that, Bryson. I definitely needed that. I'm feeling compelled to share that I'm feeling nervous right now, right? Which is something that oftentimes in professional situations, I have to fight that. I feel like I'm not supposed to be nervous. But given the topic of this chat today, I feel called to be vulnerable in that way, that I'm feeling a little bit nervous. It's showing up as like heavy heartbeat and some tingling in my hands and my extremities. And an embodied practice, just what does it mean to be embodied, right? I've heard someone say that our culture really encourages us to think of our bodies as brain taxis, there's a group called the Embodiment Group. I believe that's what they're called. They have a podcast called the Embodiment Podcast, and they throw that term around. That like we're very encouraged to think of our brains as being the site of all of our wisdom, of all of our intelligence, and as our bodies are just sort of these vessels that carry our brains around. I don't believe that that's true, right? And that actually our bodies hold an incredible amount of wisdom. Our bodies hold the wisdom of the meaning that we're making of a given situation. I might intellectually feel a way about something or have thoughts about something, but my body will bubble up and reveal wisdom about how I'm really feeling about it, right? And we'll get more into sort of the nuances of that. But what does it mean to be embodied is to turn towards sensation, to turn toward the body, and just be honest with yourself about what you're experiencing. So sometimes that can be a practice like what Bryson just did, where you're actually doing a body scan, like, checking in with myself, how do I feel? But it's the ability to be embodied comes more easily to some folks than others. I think that is true. I think that it's something that we're all born with, and that through socialization we tend to lose if we listen to our dominant culture, but that we all have the ability to strengthen. So wherever we're at, we can strengthen that muscle of being able to drop into the body and to listen to our body's wisdom more easily. We can do that through practice. We can talk more about that, but that's what we mean when we say embodied, is allowing ourselves to drop in to the body, to check in with ourselves and be honest about what's coming on.
What might we notice, Elle, if we start creating this embodied practice? What might be some of the things that you might notice, or things that you've noticed when you first started doing this practice of sort of trying to be embodied?
I actually have a very distinct memory. I was in college, living in Seattle at the time, and I had been introduced to yoga as a high school student because it was one of the physical education options at my school, which was really neat. But I was trying to get back into it because I was realizing that I was really stressed out and like not getting any exercise as a college student. So I went to, I just picked the yoga studio that was the most affordable in Seattle at the time, and went, and it was the beginning of the class, and the teacher invited us to like cross our legs and then lean forward and just like kind of relax to open up the practice. And I was like trying really hard, I was like, okay, I'm gonna like lean over like better than I've ever leaned over before, and I'm gonna like relax better than I've ever relaxed before. And she just came over and she just placed her hand on my back, and I could feel myself soften underneath her. And it's such a distinct memory. I can like remember the lighting in the room and everything. And I think for me, something that I'm always still kind of shocked by is like how much tension I hold in my body. That is a surprise. That was your question. I was like, what might we be surprised by when we first turn towards the body? I think we might be surprised by how anxious we really are a lot of the time. There's a lot of tenderness, a lot of fear, sadness. We might be surprised by how much of that is in our bodies once we really start to pay attention.
Absolutely. And something that I noticed when I started to do sort of this embodiment work in my own trainings for HMI is how much we are encouraged by systems larger than ourselves, sometimes our work environments, sometimes the larger dominant culture, like you mentioned, to turn away from our bodies, right? And how sometimes we're rewarded for not paying attention to our needs. So for me, it started in undergrad when everyone was like, oh my God, I cramped all night. And it was like, well, I was up for 24 hours. I was up for 36 hours, or I took 5-hour energy, and really not recognizing that, one, there was a disconnect between the abilities to do well in school and getting rest and food and nutrients and taking care of ourselves. But two, it's almost like this sort of glutton for pain, right? As this sort of demonstration or demarcation of commitment or authenticity as a student, but also in the workplace, really sometimes not slowing down to think about the process and like what we're learning in the process, but moving towards getting things done, right? I have a deliverable, it needs to be hit. I have a target, it needs to be hit. I have a metric that needs to be hit. And the ends justify the means. And oftentimes we're rewarded for that. And that may not always be the best way to arrive to that, but we actually can be more fruitful and abundant in getting our numbers and metrics and goals if we pay attention to the process. I always was told by colleague Julia Stern, I hope they are watching. They're in San Francisco now. They were a colleague of mine at HMI, but they always said you cannot pour from an empty cup, right? And so we're trying to be there for colleagues or folks that we support or manage. If we're not well, we can't be well. The work cannot be well, rather. So, thinking about the systems, right, and unlearning that it's not always, should be a reward for not turning in. And so thinking about that, what are some things that you can offer to people? Because this is related to belonging, diversity, inclusion, and we'll get to that in a second. But what are some things that people can do, small commitments that they can make to begin to understand embodiment? Like, what are some things that they can first do? What are like those first steps?
Well, I want to back up a little bit and responding
Mhm.
to what you're pointing out about like the college experience. Or a lot of our work experiences and work environments where there's so much incentive or just like drive to keep producing, keep pushing. And it might be that when we first start to pay attention to how our bodies, or the messages that our bodies are telling us, that our bodies are going to be like, no, stop, you don't have enough energy. And that's why we turn away from it in the first place, because we want to keep the job, we want to produce the deliverable. We're working sometimes on work that's really, really important to us, and we exist in a world where there's so much that needs to be done and needs to change. And so I think that also learning my own kind of tendencies is part of an ongoing embodied practice, and that sometimes I'm going to feel like I want to stop. Sometimes I'm going to feel like, I really just want to like watch TV or like crawl in bed and pull the covers over my head. And it doesn't mean that I always listen to exactly what my body is suggesting, because uh, sometimes it's wrong, or sometimes it's only just looking at a very sort of short view. Um, but we want to be in conversation with it. I mean, our bodies are a lot like toddlers or babies, that sometimes the baby is crying and it's like, oh, it's hungry, or oh, it's tired, right? But sometimes a baby is crying and you offer it all the things that it might be. Are you hungry? Are you cold? Are you tired? Are you uncomfortable? Um, and you sort of check in on all of those basic needs, and the baby's still crying. And you don't necessarily like completely drop everything, like halt all the activities of the household for the rest of until the baby stops crying. But you are you're like in relationship to it in a way that's loving and accepting and nurturing, and sometimes also still like getting your work done, if that makes sense. Um, and so I think, like I said at the beginning, I do think it's a practice that any of us can get better at. I think it's a muscle, this ability to like turn inward and check in on oneself. Um, the word proprioception comes to mind, which is what the word some folks use to refer to this like sort of sixth sense that we have of being able to feel our body in space and notice our body in space and the sensations within it. Um, and it is a sense that we can strengthen. And so there are some sort of obvious things come to mind of like you can like practice Tai Chi, practice yoga, a lot of different kinds of exercise that ask us to be embodied. Something like weightlifting. I really enjoy lifting weights. And I know if I'm not paying attention, then it's more likely that I'll actually injure myself. I need to be really aware of my body in space and how the different parts of my body are shaped and positioned relative to each other in order to keep myself safe. And so those kinds of activities really offer an opportunity for embodiment. But I also think that there are sort of less obvious or less conventional things as well. I think cooking is a great embodiment exercise, because some folks say that
Okay.
cooking is all five of your senses. you really have to drop into your body, drop into your sensory experience. What about you? What do you think, Bryson? Do you have any embodiment practices these days?
One of the so I'm a talker, if people cannot tell. I love to be in conversation with people. I love talking. It makes me feel good, makes me feel in my power. One of the ways that I actually begin to have an embodied practice is when I stop speaking as much. So when I move up in my listening, I actually begin to start thinking about how am I listening, right? I'm thinking about what more can I learn from what someone's sharing with me. That's how I sort of connect to my sense of being, right? Is leaning into a skill that I'm still developing, because I do have to be much more intentional. It's much easier for me to talk ad nauseum about almost anything, particularly pop culture and Mariah Carey. Um, but also just leaning into that and developing that skill makes me much more aware of my body and myself. I also notice when I drift away, right? I can disconnect and disassociate like no one else. And so in that moment, it's not a place of judgment. It's just sort of like a noticing, like, oh, in that moment I checked out what was coming up for me. Perhaps I was just wondering because that's what my mind does. Perhaps this topic was kicking up some stuff for me. How can I check back in? So even noticing just things that pull me away are important. But usually for me, really doing something that I'm not as strengthened in is really, really helpful for me to have an embodied sense of like what's going on. Um, I think what sort of leads me to think about when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and belonging, um, when people are confronted with things that may shift their perspective or may challenge a preconceived notion or may um, require them to grow a different understanding, help us to understand like how someone can sort of acknowledge it and sit with it. What does that process look? How we build that sort of strength around self-soothing or sort of sitting with discomfort in a way that doesn't completely draw us away from the conversation.
So when we're in a situation where we encounter someone whose way of existing in the world kind of confronts, or we feel confronted by, or like challenges our preconceived notions of how people are supposed to be.
Yeah.
Well, I think we will be much better positioned if we already have this practice of dropping into our bodies, right? Because I know for me, oftentimes when I have that experience, it shows up first. It's noticeable first to me as a thought, like a verbal thought, of like anything from like how dare they to like, well, if they just knew what I know, then surely they would be different, right? Or or even like maybe more kind of judgmental statements that I won't share here. But but I think so. Noticing whatever the first sign is that we're feeling that sense of confrontation, whether it be a thought or feelings of like maybe getting flushed or like tight fists, whatever our physiological reactions are, and try to get underneath the thoughts, because what will happen is if we focus on the thoughts, then the sensations and the feeling will just grow, because we're like sort of our thoughts show up as like giving us reason why it's okay that we're feeling the way that we feel. Does that make sense? So like I have this sort of automatic reaction, and then my mind jumps in and is like, well, this is why you're right. Like like that other person is wrong. That other person shouldn't be that way. Da, 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 right? And I can like hop on that thought train and like hit the gas. I don't know how trains work. Clearly, I don't know if they have a gas pedal. But you know what I'm saying? Like I can do things to make that grow and make that sensation of like I'm right and they're wrong increase.
Right.
Or I can notice, wow, I'm having a reaction to this person. And I usually, that's like the voice that I'll say it to myself, and I'll be like, whoa, okay, slow down. Like you're having a reaction. Um, and then drop into the body. And again, just turn towards the sensation. So noticing like my heart rate is increased or whatever it is. Maybe sometimes the feeling of being affronted by someone is like, oh, I feel like I'm like hit in the stomach. Or I feel angry, right? Again, like the fist clenching. Um, and so that's just the very beginning. But I think it really depends on what you're being confronted by and what your relationship to this person is. If it's someone who you love and trust or have like really, if you trust them and you want to continue connection and perpetuate connection, then it's always a good option to just be really honest and be like, I notice that I'm having a reaction and I just want to own that and like do what I need to do. So maybe it's like I need to like take a step back, like go for a walk, but I'm going to come back and I really want to be here with you. Um, if it's in a workplace, that's certainly maybe different. There are different constraints around being able to just like step out and walk away. Um,
Do,
yeah,
do power dynamics play a role in that for you, like in the workplace in terms of power? Do you think that's a huge part of? I see you nodding your head, so I'm gonna let you say more
yeah,
about that. But
yeah, of course. I mean, I think professionalism is racist and ableist and misogynist. I think that like any idea of how we're supposed to be in order to any idea of how we're supposed to be in a workplace that isn't like really directly about the work we're producing and the quality of relationships that we have with our coworkers, I think is nonsense and like should be thrown away. Um, but that doesn't. I think that and I feel really strongly about it. But I find myself in spaces where I don't feel like I can say that. Um, my mind is going in so many different directions. One thing that's coming up for me is the definition of emotional labor. This is something that in popular usage has gotten thrown around a lot more. In my experience, in the last like 5 years, it's risen to really popular usage, and people tend to use it
yeah,
to refer to like any time that we're extending ourselves emotionally um, for the betterment of another person. But actually, it comes from like labor analysis and Marxist thinking, and emotional labor prior to the really popular usage that started relatively recently was used to mean the times in our workplaces where because of an existing power differential, we have to do emotional work in order to keep our jobs. And so this shows up certainly in terms of relational work like care work or housework, right? If you're working in really intimate spaces like as a nanny or as a housekeeper, like part of you doing your job well is to make your employer feel good. And sometimes that means, a lot of times, that means stifling your own reality. Um, but it also shows up in other work too, like any kind of service work, any kind of, yeah, any workplace where part of what you're having to do is like make your boss feel good, and the reason you have to do it is to keep your job and like to physically keep yourself safe. And so that comes to mind because I think that that's something that some of you listening are probably hearing that and you're like, oh yeah, I like I can immediately think of so many times in my life where in a workplace or in another relationship I'm having to kind of like do like social acrobatics to keep another person feeling safe, or them feeling good so that I maintain my safety. And I think,
yeah,
I imagine other of you are listening and you're like, I don't really have to do that much. And that's probably an indication that other folks are feeling like they have to do that around you, or at the very least, it's an indication of your privilege that you don't have to do that. A story is coming to mind. Mine. It's not my story; it's my brother's story. But um, my my brother and I are both mixed race. We're both biracial, half black, half white, and we grew up in a very white place in the Pacific Northwest, and he still lives there. And his complexion is darker than mine, and he's 6'5". Um, and he shared with me recently that just like in the wake of Memorial Day and George Floyd and the uprisings for racial justice that have ensued and that continue. He noticed that a way of being that he had become habituated to was that when he's walking on a sidewalk, if he's approaching a white person and like passing them, he starts scuffing his feet so that they hear him coming, so that he doesn't like startle them. He said he like particularly does it with white women, particularly like petite white women, and he noticed himself doing this, and he's like, and he said, like, I'm sure that I've always done this. I don't remember when I started doing this, but he noticed it in light of these like most recent racial uprisings, and was just flooded with so much like grief and rage and all the, I think, like very understandable and appropriate emotions. But I also have my own emotional responses to that. Like, it's just like, oh my God, how much energy over the course of his life has been devoted to like unconsciously, starting to scuff his feet once he's within 25 feet of a white person on the sidewalk, right? That's emotional labor. That's what emotional labor means. Yeah.
And so for you, when you're thinking about folks being able to share those things in a workplace, what are some of the what are some things that folks can do when it comes to how marginalized groups have had to accommodate power structures? What can they start doing inside of their own practice to make sure that we're allowing these conversations to happen in a way that feel authentic and empowering for those who've experienced it? So in the case of your brother, what does it look like for colleagues to lean in and do the work to listen? What's that process? What can that process look like for some of those folks looking to figure out how to be better around that?
Yeah, I think again, I'm probably going to continue to repeat this, like turning towards the body, noticing, noticing, oh, am I reacting, like what you were saying, Bryson, in terms of really embodied listening and embodied communication, noticing when someone else is speaking, what reactions are bubbling up in me, and not jumping on the thought train and like jumping to thinking about, oh, what am I going to say next? How am I going to respond? But just letting that impulse go and just noticing the body and noticing trends in yourself of, do I tend to react differently towards folks who occupy different identity categories, or who I like assign to different identity categories? And then I think it's really palpable if someone's doing that embodied listening. I can tell. I think, as opposed to if they're doing that sort of inactive, jumping on their own thought train and just jumping in to the next time I take a breath and adding their 2 cents.
Right.
My sense is that people can really tell the difference. And so I invite folks to just kind of practice engaging in really embodied listening and seeing if people in your life start to respond differently. If there's a disarming that happens. Sometimes I'm noticing even in myself right now that like sometimes that embodied sense, and of course I'm talking, so I'm like trying to practice embodied talking, but I could imagine doing this. I can do this too while I'm listening, is like I'm kind of dropping behind my eyes and letting my vision soften a little bit, taking in the peripheral, really taking in the space that I'm in. Again, proprioception, feeling my body in space, feeling myself sitting on the floor, the parts of my body that are making contact with the ground, and just really noticing. I think that people can tell the difference if they're being listened to really actively.
Yeah. One thing I say. Yeah. One thing I say in trainings is really, I know when people are listening to me or I'm listening to other folks when I have lots of questions to ask, particularly something that I'm unaware of or something I assume to be true. So I give this sort of anecdote in my trainings around how gender and how sexual orientation have evolved in terms of our understanding. So, well, I actually should say that we're returning to a indigenous understanding that gender and sexuality exists in a continuum. But for folks who are millennials, so hi, I'm a Bryce, I'm a millennial. When we were younger, Pluto was a planet. Pluto was a planet. It was a thing. There were 9 planets in our solar system. Pluto was a planet. And then somewhere around 8th grade, 9th grade for me, all of a sudden, like Pluto was a star. And we were like, wait, there are 9 planets. You're telling me now that Pluto's a star. This doesn't make any sense. And I was in a training and I was using that analogy to say, things shift. And our science teacher said, well, actually, our taxonomy around planets was wrong. So technically, Pluto is a dwarf planet. It's a smaller type of planet. And our understandings of how we categorize things has actually shifted, right? And so this idea that when we're talking about these emerging identities are actually just not new. They've always been there. There's new language for them, which I will certainly admit, but there's actually a returning that this has always existed on a continuum, and our taxonomy, our categorization actually was very limited. And we know that by virtue of history and anthropology, but just in terms of the human experience, we know that we're constantly growing. Like our noses and our ears, we're constantly growing through our lifetime. And so one of the things that I want to impart to people is like, for me, questions are always the appropriate thing when you're feeling uncomfortable. Questions that are really geared towards trying to understand, right? Not trying to undermine or not trying to undercut or be snarky, but really being like, wow, I really have only ever known scientifically that there are 2 types of bodies. What do you mean by intersex? Like, I want to know more about that. Like, can you point me to some resources? Because 1, I'm not an endocrinologist, so like this is not my area, right, of profession. But 2, I'm curious because again, the assumption is that I want to create a more inclusive space. So when we're thinking about what does it mean to go on this embodied journey, sometimes it means to say, wow, I don't know. You know what, Al? I have no idea. Let me get back to you. Or, I don't know what that word means. I'm going to look on my little smartphone during the training so that I can be more enlightened about the conversation. This need to posture as all knowing, or that there's fear around expansive ideas of knowledge or experiences, is something that I think is also part of embodiment, is being like, there's no way I'm ever going to know everything about everything, right? Like, I know I'm a triple Virgo. I know that I think I know everything all the time. However, right, like I can't blame my astrological sign on feeling like I know all the things, right? It's important for me in my embodiment to say, let me ask questions because I don't know. And that's actually a strength, to say I didn't know. Or like you said, I feel a bit uncomfortable about that. It's shifting my sense of reality, right? Sometimes it's like, ooh, child, I feel a way about that. I feel some type of way about, an emerging thing because it's shifting my sense and being able to own that.
Something that I remind myself of often, and actually my brother reminds me of often, I feel like he's really present with me in this conversation, is that all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think that like folks in the sciences or the social sciences maybe have heard that before, but I think that it's absolutely applicable to our social models as well, our social constructs, that, at some point our ancestors came up with this idea of a binary gender system because it was useful for something. I mean, I think we should assume that they probably had some reason that that made sense to them and that that worked. But as useful as that may have been at one point, it was never absolutely correct. And any model that we replace it with is going to be sort of an updated model, or returning to a model that's existed forever in terms of returning back to indigenous models. But no matter what we find that is the most appropriate and the most useful for our time, or for whatever community we find ourselves in, I think it's also important to just hold that loosely, to not ever get to try not to get dogmatic about it, because there are limits to the usefulness of even a new model, even the best model that we can imagine. And there will be a time when it gets less useful and it needs to be replaced too. That's something that I
Absolutely.
try to remind myself of all the time, especially like, I think about this certainly in terms of the identities, the axes of identity on which I hold a lot of privilege. It's really important for me to remember that I have been constantly affirmed in these existing models that the way that like my values around work and class and money and education have just always been affirmed because I hold class privilege. Um, and so it's easier to then cut myself off to all the myriad of evidence that exists that that model is not useful and that there are limits to it. But also in the identity axes on which I hold less privilege or, you know, carry more marginalization, that it can feel really tempting to cling to my, for example, gender nonconforming or agender identity in the same way that some other folks might cling to a binary system of gender. Because there's something grounding about that. It's like, well, it's declarative, like, this is what I am. This, you know, there's stability in this after so many years of personal exploration and feelings of doubt around my gender identity. It can be very tempting to like cling to that as being true with a capital T, and it's equally as important in those instances to just hold it loosely, right? That this is meaningful to me and that matters, but it's not absolute and it might change. And if I encounter someone else who maybe understands that word to mean something different than me, or like, yeah, uses it in a different way, or thinks that it's not real, or thinks even that it's like antiquated, like that, there are probably going to come times when that'll happen, and that's okay too. It doesn't have to represent ego death for me or like ego threat.
Right, right, right. So when we're thinking about like, so we're trying to have a 360 approach to this idea of like embodied practice, thinking about how do we know what we know? How do we create more space? What are some of the first, how can people, when people are confronted with this information and people have an adverse reaction, so someone's like, you know, you're used to going to work every day where we talk about pronouns and this is the thing, and then now suddenly you're at home, you're working, and your pronouns are not being honored. Aside from sort of like that person needing to find places to take care of themselves, how do we begin to empower people to have some of those conversations with intimate loved ones, with friends, with other people who they may share space with, who aren't the most affirming? Like, what do you think that first step could be in saying, hey, actually, that doesn't feel good for me?
I think you kind of nailed it. I think it goes a long way to remind someone. You can even preface by saying, there's something I want to talk to you about and it feels kind of scary, but our relationship is really important to me. So I want to like step into this discomfort in this space of honesty. Reminding someone or affirming that what you're attempting to do is to step toward connection and like toward the relationship. That can be disarming for folks. And then saying exactly what you said, like, this doesn't feel good to me. Maybe acknowledging like, I don't think you're misgendering me on purpose. I don't think that that you're purposefully trying to deny a part of my identity that's really important to me, but that's how it feels to me. So can we talk about that?
Mm. Mm. So really sort of creating a space where we're saying this is about our relationship and I really value you, and this is causing me harm. That may not have been your intention, but even with the best of intentions, you're causing harm. And so I want to be in conversation with you about how we can transform that harm into a place of mutual respect and love and affirmation. What does it look like? So oftentimes people, you know, we're coming into this space, our workspaces, and hopefully our participants feel the same. Similarly, not always, but similarly, that they're able to sort of use their name and pronouns or talk about the most salient parts of their identity with pride and joy. Um, Young people, right? So like now, people are home with their kids. Their young people may have this idea or these emerging identities that a person may accept from a colleague or may accept at work, but perhaps they have trouble accepting it from their child or their loved one that is in their care. How do you get people to start thinking about the connections between how we show up for like our peers and our young people and seeing them as people?
And this is really the meat of our topic together today, right? That there's so much information and motivation around anti-oppression and anti-racist work happening in public spaces right now, and in workplaces. But what does it mean to also take like all these ideas and put them into practice in every relationship in our life? I think one, grounding into that intention is that your intention? Because maybe it's not. Like, don't do it just because I said it. But if that's something that feels important to you to be anti-oppressive in all of the sort of levels of relationship, tiers of relationship of your life, but it's not really tiers, right? Because it's really kind of like some relationships are a little bit further away, and then some are really close and really intimate. Then I think maybe even like write that down. Like again, don't do it because I said it. Don't necessarily just use my language for it. But what is that? What is the piece that you've identified that's your growing edge and that you want to grow and you want to improve? Yeah, I wouldn't. I think that that's a huge step. And then once you've made that intention and clarified it for yourself with yourself, remembering that that feeling of feeling confronted or like our ways that we understand the world to be are called into question, that visceral sense, we can begin to have a different relationship to that. Our body will send signals like we're being threatened, because there's a whole like threat alarm system that's going to go off. But we can remember, oh yeah, this is actually, I've encountered a teacher. That's what that means. And because I'm on this path with this intention that I'm already clear about for myself, actually sometimes in social situations when I have that alarm system go off, it actually means that I've encountered someone who maybe can teach me something. Maybe they have something to teach me. And when it comes to your kiddos or your family members and your loved ones, I'm not a parent, so I should just say that up front. I mean, I can only, it's a stretch of my imagination to imagine like what it feels like to be a parent right now, and have your kids home with you so much of the time. Can you repeat the question, Bryson? I feel a little bit lost.
Yeah. So in other words, I'm going to use my colloquial language here. So sometimes, in my experience, someone says that's cute for them and not for my kid, right? They can do that out there. This is not cute for you, right? And it's like, oh, you're like a part of the LGBTQ ERG, or you're a part of this, if you're working in school, you're part of the GSA care team, but your child comes out to you, or your child demonstrates that the sex and gender assigned at birth don't align with who they are. And suddenly there's like this disconnect between this practice that we may have in the workplace and then for our own partners or children or cousins or parent. And so I have noticed this in my work that there's been, again, a disconnect between that practice for colleagues and people outside the home versus inside the home or inside the circle. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about possibly what can someone do that's trying to rectify or trying to shift that disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I would say turning towards your body, noticing what emotions are coming up. Because again, like your mental chatter is going to be resistance, explaining why your resistance is justified and why it's okay. But what quality of resistance are you feeling? I'm sure for a lot of parents, it's fear. You're fearful for your child that being someone who exists outside of gender and sexual norms is less safe. I mean, we have data that shows that that's true. We know that that continues to be true. So it's not even unreasonable to have some fear on behalf of your kid. And do you, again, what is your intention? Is your intention to like really be anti-oppressive? Then you have to overcome that fear. I will say, as a gender nonconforming person, a child of like very well-meaning, loving parents, one piece of advice that I would offer you is to find a space, a relationship that is not your relationship with your kid, to do some of the processing. Like, don't have your kid be the one that you're processing all your feelings with, because you might say things that hurt their feelings, or that make you sound ignorant. And it's okay to be ignorant. You are ignorant, but you're figuring it out. But your kids don't need to hear every step of that, like every ignorance that you're working through. You don't want them to hear that, because they're going to remember pieces that were just one of many things that you were saying. So that's a piece of advice that comes from a very personal place. And then, I think finding relationships with folks who also share that intention of coming to a place of being more practiced in being anti-oppressive, but finding folks who are at the same step of the work as you are. I caught the very tail end of the last panel, and it's a really parallel piece of advice to a workplace. Be really, really honest, like, this is where I'm at in this process. And I promise you there are resources that are geared toward where you're at in your process. So if you're at like gender nonconforming kid 101, like those resources exist for you. And there are other parents who are there too. There's a really beautiful podcast that I have listened to over the last few years. It's called How to Be a Girl. It's a podcast about a mom in Seattle. And her musings about her experience of her young child coming out as transgender and transitioning socially in school. And I guess I think one reason that podcast is coming to mind is because she's really honest about her feelings. But these are the exact conversations that I'm suggesting it's good that she didn't have with her kid first. She's processing. She's finding parents who are in similar spots or even like a ways down the path and can offer her advice.
A question that's coming from that was beautiful. A question that's come in that I think that we've talked about before, and you mentioned it earlier, is that it's easier sometimes for some folks to drop into their bodies than others. Questions from the participants is: what if someone's experienced lots of trauma, lots of harm around their bodies, and it makes it really hard for them to sort of drop in? What are some things or some tips or some resources that you can share about how people can begin to start healing in that so they're able to drop into their body a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. If you are self-identifying as someone who has experienced trauma and maybe is even still experiencing post-traumatic symptoms, or even if you're beginning to do this work and you're like, I really want to turn toward my body when I notice that I'm feeling defensive or feeling confronted by someone else's identities, but I get triggered or overwhelmed or anxious when I try to do that, then I absolutely think that tending to yourself is a worthwhile step in this process, the intention of growing to be someone who's more anti-oppressive. And your body's alarm system is just kind of on overdrive, and it's not broken and it can be fixed. But it's certainly, like, if you're feeling like, blah, this feels terrifying and this feels uncomfortable. Yeah, I encourage you to seek out help for yourself. And there are so many great modalities. I'm biased, I'm a therapist, so I would definitely recommend seeking out a therapist, someone who you can talk to. Um, if you have trusted friends, you might, I mean, I think a lot of people are in therapy these days. They don't necessarily talk about it, but if you have some close folks, you can start to ask around if they have a trusted clinician who they work with and really trust. That's a great way to find someone. Um, Actually, just New York City has a great resource called NYC Well that you can always call, and you can speak to a licensed therapist, and then they'll also follow up with recommendations of services that make sense for the particularities of your situation. So you can look up NYC Well, or you can just call 311 and say that you'd like to access NYC Well. There are some particular modalities. So EMDR is a system that is very evidence-based, and where they actually it can be pretty intense, that treatment, but where you will reactivate the traumatic experience, but in a therapeutic setting and with these actual like vibrating rods that pulsate and vibrate from side to side. And it helps to reorganize the association in your brain. Like, because it activates both sides of your body by having these alternatively vibrating rods, then it also lights up both sides of your brain. I'm not an expert in that, but that has been shown to be very, very successful for a lot of people. So you might seek out an EMDR therapist specifically. I'm also biased, but I'm currently training to become a hypnotherapist, and I have found in my personal experience that hypnotherapy offers such a quick and transformative course of treatment for feeling safe in your body again and coming back into contact with the resources that you already contain. The reason that you want to feel safer, and that the way that you're feeling currently doesn't feel okay, is because you've experienced that before. You know that it's possible, you know that it exists. And so the pathways in your brain have gotten stuck and feeling like more easily triggered, right? And having this overactive alarm system, but you have these experiences inside of you already of what it feels like to be soothed, what it feels like to feel safe. And so I definitely would recommend finding a hypnotherapist too, if that's something that interests you at all. Yeah, the list goes on, but I think that's a good short list to start with.
Beautiful. The last question before we offer our sort of embodied practice opportunity for people to do at home. When people are coming to these conversations, they're often coming with multiple different intentions, and there's different impacts. What are some ways that you think that people can enter in the conversation, or what is sort of like a practice or modality that people can utilize when they're realizing that they're not going in the right direction? Like, how do we sort of like say, I entered in this conversation, it did not go well, or it's not going well in the ways that I thought it was? What are some things that people can do to sort of walk back? So an example I give is that oftentimes, because people don't ask the use of pronouns, we assume people's pronouns. And we have a little acronym that we offer when people misgender people or use the wrong pronouns. We say apologize, thank the person for correcting them, right? So if you say, I'm sorry, and they go, well, it's okay, it's actually not okay. So you thank them, thank you for correcting me. Then we actually use their correct pronoun. We go, oh, wrong pronoun. Thank you for telling me, she, and then you say, let's move on. What's a similar practice when entering into these conversations around belonging, acceptance, affirmation that people can sort of utilize? Or what's worked for you?
Well, something you said much earlier, Bryson, was something along the lines of like, we can get so attached to our way of seeing things that we just like come to believe that it's right. I'm paraphrasing, but I think it's not because we're bad or because our brains are broken. It's like our brains are designed to like categorize things like great. I'm familiar with this, I can move on, right? But sometimes that like rote categorization misses things or it gets outdated. So I think one, just having compassion with ourselves, that this happens to everyone. It doesn't mean that you're broken. Everything we come to this present moment with is a result of what we've had the ability to experience and access previously. And so if we've never accessed something before, haven't had enough experience firsthand with a new system of identity, etc., then of course we're going to make mistakes. That's actually our brains working the way that we want them to, right? We don't want to wake up every day and be like, oh my God, what is this like crazy world? No, it's great. Like, this is a table, this is a glass, like I can move on with my day. But again, sometimes that rote categorization misses things or it gets outdated. And then I think it's important to be really honest and be able to say, like, let's say, I've stepped maybe 2 steps in the wrong direction, and then I come to and I'm like, oh my God, what have I'm afraid I've offended this person. Then be like, I realize that thing that I just said was inappropriate or maybe not in line with the person who I'm trying to be. That's actually language that I use a lot, is like, that doesn't really align with like the way I'm trying to be in the world. And I realize that I did that, and I want to point it out because, one, I just want to like mark this for myself, that just reminder, this is not how I want to be in the world. And I want to also point it out and kind of like confess, and then acknowledge like maybe acknowledge like how you are trying to be in the world. Like, I'm trying to be someone around whom folks of all different gender identities and expressions feel really safe, and I'm so sorry if I failed at doing that in this moment. And then like be open to how the person responds. Maybe they'll respond like you said, Bryce, and being like, oh no, it's okay. I think it is important to say, thank you for saying that. That's really kind of you. I don't think it's okay, so I'm gonna commit to being better moving forward. But thank you so much. Or maybe they get really offended, which is like totally their right to do. Maybe they want to distance themselves from you. That's okay too, right? Like, if that's what they need to do to keep themselves safe, we certainly don't want to chase them down or disrespect their boundaries.
Right. Well, I want to invite you to invite us into a sort of opportunity for us to practice some embodiment as we close. So I'll turn it over to you.
So we'll bookend our experience together. And similarly to the invitation that Bryson offered us at the beginning, I invite you to find a comfortable seat. Maybe you're lying down. Maybe you're sitting cross-legged on the floor like I am. But feel yourself really sinking in. And we'll take 3 more breaths together, emptying out your lungs. And then when you're ready, taking a big inhale. And letting your exhale be nice and slow and thorough. Taking another inhale. And letting that exhale be really nice and long. And your third and final exhale, if you haven't already, inhale. And letting that be really nice and long, and slow and thorough. And if you feel comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. You might keep your eyes open and cast your gaze down, letting your eyelids be soft and heavy wherever you feel safe and comfortable. And I want you to allow your body to draw your attention to wherever it's most needed. Perhaps there's an area of acute tension acute sensation, whatever it is, just trusting your body to let you know where to draw your attention right now. And just practice. What does it mean to turn toward this sensation? Maybe there's a story that comes up in your mind. Maybe there's a thought train. Resisting the urge to jump on board and continuing to turn back toward your body, toward your physical sensation. You may notice a tendency to label what's going on as tension, heat, discomfort, etc. Just notice. It's not good or bad. Just notice. Notice if you find yourself labeling it as good or bad. Notice if your mind wants to say that this sensation shouldn't be here. And just letting that go. Because it is here. And it's supposed to be here. Letting your attention focus in on that point one more time, wherever it is. And then letting that go, and letting your attention broaden. Noticing where your body is making contact with the ground, or your chair, where you're supported. And we'll take one big breath. Maybe it's the biggest breath you've taken today. Inhale. And let that go, maybe audibly. And I invite you to open your eyes when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Elle, for that. And thank you for being in conversation with us. Thank you for all of our participants. And again, our corporate sponsors, the folks at Facebook for helping us with the tech. This was a great and fruitful conversation for me. I hope it was for you all as well. And I wish you well on your journeys to making sure that we feel more of a sense of belonging. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Have a good day.
Tastes like strawberries on a summer evening, and it sounds just like a song. I want more berries and that summer feeling. It's so wonderful and warm. Breathe me in, breathe me out. I don't know if I could ever go without. I'm just thinking out loud. I don't know if I could ever go without. Watermelon sugar high, watermelon sugar high, watermelon sugar high, watermelon sugar high, watermelon sugar high. Tastes like strawberries on a summer evening, and it sounds just like a song. I want your belly and that summer feeling. I don't know if I could ever go high. Watermelon sugar.
Rain on